Okay, good morning everyone. It's 9:30 and time for me to open this session of the Places for Everyone joint plan. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, thank you. I'll just through some housekeeping. I may ask in a moment who's not been here before. I think it might be a couple of new faces, but I'll start by doing some normal housekeeping. A reminder for everyone to switch mobile phones, laptops and other devices to silent mode, please, or off. Water is provided and will be replenished during adjournments, and we've always asked people not to bring in hot food or drink into the room. And there are various parts of the building where you can get that in adjournments. Toilets are located in the reception area where you will have entered the building. Going to assume there are no fire alarm tests this morning, so if the fire alarm does sound, then please vacate the building either by the door to my right or the door to the rear. And the programme officers, Helen and Yvonne, which I'm sure you're all now very familiar with, are around all morning to assist if any assistance is required. We're going to be talking this morning about policies JP Strat 9 to JP Strat 11. So, assuming everyone's here for the right session. Are there any new people here who've not sat? Yes, yes, quite a few. Although I suspect you're all familiar with how these work, but obviously just for completeness, for those who haven't been here, in the normal way, I will start each agenda item or significant issue with some questions to the GMCA team, and when we've heard the responses, I'll open up contributions from others. When you wish to speak, if you could turn your nameplate on its end, and I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. And when I invite you to speak, please say who you are, and if appropriate, who you represent. And as always, please focus your comments on our questions and specific points made by others. And we try and, if possible, keep each contribution normally to no longer than a minute or two to ensure that they're focused and allow everyone a chance to speak if they can on a particular issue. Also, please remember that there's no need to repeat or summarise what you wrote in your representations or written statements. We've read those. And obviously, there's also no need to repeat or tell me that you agree with what other people have said, because a good point made once is a good point. It doesn't get any better through repetition. And normally, we will give GMCA the chance to sum up their position at the end of each item on the agenda or respond to any comments that have been made. Action points. Obviously, we've decided, I think we're going to, the sum total of action points from this week we're not going to go through today. Obviously, some of that depends on what we're talking about today anyway, and we've got sessions starting quite quickly next week, so it may well be we may give an oral update on Tuesday, but the likelihood is that our sort of written note may well sum up the 2 weeks.
Indeed,
in a row. If that
rather
makes sense.
Suspected that might be the case. Yes,
I think it might be fluid, but that's how we're thinking at the moment.
Sure. Thank you.
Anything you wish to raise?
No, sir.
We've had your note. We've had your response to our IN 18 note, which I think should have been published this morning. So that's just something that people may not be aware is a new document, which relates to Gypsy and Travellers. That's the only thing there. We'll probably have an adjournment at 11-ish, with a view to finishing at 1 o'clock, if at all possible, or no later than 1 o'clock, if at all possible. We'll see how we go.
Did you say midday, sir?
Sorry? You haven't seen how many questions I've got. So, yes. Any procedural issues from around the room? Okay, good. So we'll start off as normal, and as particularly as there are some new people in the room with introductions, starting with GMCA.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Chris Katkowski, KC for the 9.
Good morning, Duncan McCorkadale, Manchester City Council.
Good morning, Caroline Wright, Trafford Council.
Morning, Claire Taylor-Russell from the GMCA.
Morning, Marge Powner, Friends of Carrington Moss and Savory to Manchester's Greenbelt today.
Thank you. And moving round.
Morning, Andrew Murray, Manchester Airport Group.
Morning, Poppy Oakey from Eden Planning, instructed by Moorland Capital No. 1 Limited.
Morning, Ian Gilbert, Planning Director at Barton Wilmore, and we're representing Redrow Homes.
Good morning, John Coxon from Emery Planning, here representing Wayne Estates.
Morning, Simon Pemberton from Litchfields, representing United Utilities.
Morning, Paul Tucker, KC, instructed by Mr Anthony Aitken, Head of UK Planning at Colliers, who sits behind me in a shy fashion, representing Royal London in relation to matters, all matters of Timperley Wedge, but that'll be the last you'll hear of site specifics from me this morning.
Very good, thank you. Well, we'll see. Depends what the questions are.
All right, I retract my observation then instantly.
But probably not. Okay. We'll crack straight on then with policy JP Strat 9, which is southern areas. But before I do, I will just say, obviously, we had a long discussion, or several discussions yesterday about various strategy elements of the strategy policy. I don't, unless they come up in discussion, I'm not necessarily wanting the councils to reiterate everything they reiterated yesterday. It's quite likely some of these issues will come up again, but I obviously know the council's position on some of this. If people have any concerns or issues about that, I think some of the people around the room were here anyway, so they're aware of the council's position on some of these issues, but they'll no doubt crop up. And some of my questions will be repeats of yesterday anyway, just for completeness. So I think overall we should end up getting everything out of it we need to, but obviously you'll have an opportunity to raise anything this side. People haven't been here that wasn't raised yesterday, so if that makes sense. But I don't want to go through that whole kind of opening part of the agenda again, as we did. I'm sure we'll get there naturally. So JP Strat 9, southern areas, seems like very much the cousin of JP Strat 6, the northern areas, quite similar in its approach. I'm just going to go through some of my points and immediately get into issues we got into yesterday, so you may want to just point me to those. At the start of the policy states the economic competitiveness of southern areas will be protected and enhanced. So the question, I suppose, is this consistent with what we've been discussing in terms of maintaining or sustaining the competitiveness of the southern areas? And I guess, what does that look like in terms of what you're seeking to achieve?
So your first question, Sarah, is because the wording is slightly different from the sustaining.
There's two things. It's slightly different, which I assume is it's the same. It's just editorial again. But also, again, we talked a lot yesterday about what does boosting northern competitiveness look like. We've talked about it before. Again, the corollary of that is what does maintaining southern competitiveness look like, and how do you measure it, and how do we know you've been successful?
On this occasion, so 4.21 of the plan, pages 48, 49, is under the heading of the spatial strategy. We find sustain southern competitiveness. What does sustain mean? Well, it means to protect and enhance, as we explain in policy 9. So they're entirely consistent. And yesterday we had a discussion about, I mean, we've had discussions previously about what does a boost mean, what does sustain mean. We had a discussion yesterday where we moved on to the word competitiveness. And I explained frankly, it's an easy to understand word. And there we are. I mean, I'll just refer to our discussion yesterday in a different context. So, but here, as it's the south, we've moved from boosting to sustaining, as you know.
Okay. So, yeah, okay.
It's all consistent.
It's a consistent approach. Yeah. One other element, again, was discussed yesterday in the context of Strat 6, is the reference to strong emphasis on prioritising brownfield land. We had a discussion about whether that was consistent with national policy.
Yes.
I'm going to, again, assume your answer is the same, but for those who weren't here, perhaps you want to reiterate that?
It's entirely consistent with national policy, and my first Malteser of the day, it's an appropriate strategy. I get a Malteser for every time I say appropriate strategy, by the way. It's an appropriate strategy to have a plan which has a strong emphasis on prioritising the reuse of brownfield land. I mean, it's one of those. Surely there can't be any criticism of a strategy which is based on that.
And this is written in the context, as you say, that these policies are not to be relied on in a development management perspective. They are to be relied on through a local plan making perspective.
That's right, and I've checked our matter statement, and there aren't any stray erroneous references for the policies we're discussing this morning. Yes, they are all meant to set the scene for future local plans.
I'm just going to say this now, if you like to. On Tuesday, we have a session about the sustainability policies, and JPS1 refers to the same thing, prioritising brownfield land or previous development.
Yeah.
I'll put a pin in that for now, but obviously that discussion may well be similar, but that's taken from a more development, taking a development management point of view,
Absolutely.
so it may well be different.
So there
different
may be
emphasis.
a different, yes,
Yeah, okay.
there may well be a different perspective. when
Just flagging that up now.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed.
The policy only refers to maximising the economic potential and benefits of investment in altering Trafford's main town centres and Manchester Airport. Obviously, we've had comments that suggest that that's missing out on other aspects of southern Manchester, Greater Manchester, that perhaps should be reflected, including New Carrington, for example. Any response to those concerns? By not mentioning other areas, is the policy going to be less effective?
Well, New Carrington has its own strat policy, as we know, 2-1 from this one. I'll just look to my left for an explanation as to why these particular centres and locations have been picked out, if you like.
Yeah, in terms of why, in particular, New Carrington's not been included within the policy itself, as just explained, it has its own standalone strategic policy and also its own site-specific allocation policy under JPA 33. Having said that, it is mentioned or name-checked, as it were, in paragraph 4.3 of the supporting text, to set that strategic context of what is contained within the southern area and the things that one should look to in terms of trying to understand what the context of the strategic policy area covers. Altrincham Town Centre is the main town centre for Trafford, and a bit like all of the other boroughs in the plan, that is our principal town centre, and no other ones are mentioned. That I believe is consistent across the plan.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure others may wish to come back on that. Again, I think we talked a bit about this yesterday in terms of, you've said they're not for development management. We've obviously got to, discussions about that. We've got to take all that away. But we also talked about elements of these policies, which are things like talking about design quality and all that kind of stuff. Again, is there anything you wish to add to that?
Well,
point?
Just for the benefit of those who weren't here yesterday and who didn't spend the evening watching YouTube to catch up.
I'm sure, did you all watch the evening?
It was gripping, sir, to be honest.
Funnily enough.
I think that was sarcasm, which I don't.
Not a bit of it, sir.
So, as I said yesterday, my starting position yesterday was that these references to good quality design, etc., were fine, if you like. But as the day wore on, my resistance crumbled. But basically, no, as I said yesterday, I think that these policies, these references to good quality design and so on and so forth, expressed in different ways depending on which strat policy you're looking at, don't really need to be in these strat policies, because there are and will be policies elsewhere which expect high quality design. So yes, our position is that we need to work our way through these strat policies and refocus them so they actually set out what's spatially significant about the particular areas, each area in turn that's covered by each of the strat policies, rather than in most cases, but not all, repeating, and very often in different language, these aspirations which you find elsewhere anyway.
Thanks. Obviously, we'll bear that in mind.
Yes,
in coming to review.
Indeed.
In terms, and I think again, I apologise again. There is a lot of repetition because the policies are very similar and do the same things, but different people in the room. Some of the points we were making yesterday are how you how the councils, if you like, interpret this through a local plan perspective. And again, we heard yesterday, particularly from the gentleman your left, who said, explained how the councils would be bringing, or would use this policy, if you like. And I think, again, it might be useful for those who weren't here to set out how you see these policies being useful from a local plan perspective when they say what they say.
Thank you, sir. As you mentioned yesterday, I very much set it out from a Manchester sort of perspective, because we were looking at core growth area, inner areas, but so colleagues from Trafford may want to just add to this today. But in essence, what we're looking at is that there are sort of policy hooks within these strat policies that provide us the context of where we then need to take further detail within our own respective local plans. Now that may well be for other sort of aspects in terms of further allocations in certain areas. It might be around thematic policies and also aspects in terms of development management decisions that then sit within those local plans. So these are very useful in terms of providing that sort of overarching context for those local plans, while sort of knitting it all together as a whole within for the whole of Greater Manchester. And I'm furiously fighting not mentioning regional planning again, but I almost feel tempted to do so, because it does have that analogy with respect to what was set out in regional spatial strategy in terms of looking at the sort of key strategic elements that then fed through to local plans. And by way of example, for Manchester, that did lead through to specific policies within the core strategy that picked up on that overarching strategy that had been set out in RSS. So it is a useful analogy in that sense.
Again, we touched on it with strategy with Strat 6 about this policy is different to some of the others because there is, and we talked about the numbers and what the numbers mean and everything, but this is a policy that has no numbers in it. Strat 6 has no numbers. The explanation for Strat 6 was that it's because this is like the top tier, and then there are other policies sit below it. Is it the same principle?
Yeah, in essence, and yet again, we've got policies that within this particular chapter with respect to Manchester Airport and also with respect to Carrington. So there are key aspects. And to a degree, but certainly from Manchester's point of view, the southern areas is there's a particular sort of quality with respect to the southern areas. We have got sort of key growth or key sort of aspirations and elements that we'll need to set out in the local plan with respect to Wythenshawe. But then when you look at the kind of vast majority in terms of the Manchester southern area, we're talking about a lot of sort of, to be quite frank, it's a lot of householder applications, and that's the sort of nature of planning that we get within southern Manchester. So whereas yesterday we talked about core growth area, etc., where clearly there's a lot of development, and our plan in turn will reflect that and bring that forward. The southern areas, yes, it provides those sort of key policies in terms of what's in this plan, but there are some characteristics that perhaps differentiate it as well.
Just to make it clear from your perspective as local plan preparers, local authors, the lack of that quantitative guide in these policies doesn't cause you any particular concern, and how you would deliver?
No, I don't think it will inhibit local plans in doing what they're intended to do. I think it's also worth sort of noting the fact that the strategic policies allow the local plans to make sure that they deliver the spatial strategy of places for everyone. Without these, there is a potential risk that a local plan could go off on a slight tangent and inadvertently undermine the boosting the competitiveness of the north. So I think in that respect, these set a very good framework for the local plans in order to make sure that collectively we don't inadvertently undermine the wider spatial strategy for GM. And in that respect, with regards to numbers, because there is that flexibility allowance, and at this point we don't fully know exactly where all of the development is going to go to meet the requirements and the need, that doesn't inhibit us in terms of being able to provide that detail later on.
Thank you very much. I just want to move on to the proposed modification to the last paragraph. I'm just going to find it on here. So it's the, sorry, not isn't last paragraph, last sentence, sorry, the first paragraph, I should say. So this is, again, similar to other modifications where you've proposed, where it talks about selective release of green belt in key locations. The modification, again, as others have, makes it clear that it's about this. I just, if you want to just, again, for the benefit of people who aren't here, explain the reasoning for those and why you think it's necessary.
Yes, but it's arisen because a number of those who have made representations on the plan read or perhaps misread or perhaps understandably misread this last sentence of the first paragraph to suggest that Places for Everyone was encouraging further release of green belt in key locations, further, that is, above and beyond what Places for Everyone does. And it's simply to make clear that the selective release of green belt in key locations, which is referred to in the policy in Places for Everyone, unsurprisingly, is referring to the selective release of green belt in key locations that Places for Everyone makes. So that's the explanation for the additional words. It's just to ensure there isn't confusion about it. As I said yesterday, other changes to the plan elsewhere that we previously discussed make it quite clear and recognise that Places for Everyone isn't in any way seeking to, nor could it, constrain or straitjacket future local plans from having to look at all these issues all over again, because they're going to have to, and deciding whether at the time when those plans are made there is indeed a need for further greenbelt release. But that's not for this plan, that's for future plans. And this plan is simply talking consistently about the green belt that it releases.
Yeah. And a comment that was made, I think, in yesterday, and I think in representations, again, written statements, it's the concern about the modification, as we put it, was that it would prohibit councils from looking again at Greenbelt, and I suppose with your suggested modification to 11.2,
yes.
And again, this point was made yesterday,
Indeed.
that are those two ideas conflicting in some way?
Thank you, sir. Yes, it's, as you rightly say, a point raised yesterday by a gentleman sitting on this side of the room, I seem to remember, at the far end of the table. No, I don't see any inconsistency at all between the plan speaking about its greenbelt releases when it's speaking about its greenbelt releases, but making it quite clear elsewhere that it is in no way seeking to constrain, and as I've said, nor could it anyway, constrain future local plans doing their job, which is to look at all of these issues afresh to see whether, for example, there's any need for further allocations, which in turn plainly could, but it's not for this plan to say yay or nay, could lead those future plans to looking again to the green belt.
Okay,
so there's no inconsistency at all.
Thank you very much. That covers, I think, everything I wanted to say about this one. Any comments about Strat 9 from around the room? We'll start with Save Green Man. I'm going to get this name right. Save Greater Manchester Greenbelt.
Okay.
First, thank you.
I've got a couple of points on the policy, but can I just start by talking about the Greenbelt topic paper 070125, and just picking up the last point from Mr. Kakowski, is it says on page 195 and other pages, to avoid the 10 districts proposing further amendments to the Greenbelt in local plans, it is proposed that this will be the only opportunity to make changes, including those that are small scale, such as this one. So just, it's useful to have the clarification, but there may be changes needed to other documents.
Okay, I mean, that's a more general point in southern areas. I suppose it does feed through a lot of points, so we may as well cover it. I think we'll cover it off now if you've got a response to that.
Yes, sir, absolutely. Well, the position is, as I explained it a few moments ago, and to the extent that that's inconsistent with something that was said in the topic paper, then the position is, as I explained it a few moments ago. Yes, I mean, as you've heard from us, as far as we're concerned, as far as the 9 are concerned, we've released through Places for Everyone the green belt that's necessary in order to, in effect, to make up the numbers, to deal with the flexibility allowance in relation to housing and to deal with quantitative and qualitative issues in relation to commercial development. So we think we've released enough green belt, but we can't constrain future local plans from doing their job. And if when they come to be made, it's discovered that this plan was overly optimistic, as some have been saying, rather than overly pessimistic, as others have been saying, then those local authorities will have to consider whether there are exceptional circumstances, to the extent that they're Greenbelt authorities, obviously.
Okay. So you say it's not suggesting there's been a change in position since topic paper. It's just how it's interpreted.
It's how it's seen. I mean, yes. To be quite clear, as I've said before, we the nine are not encouraging further release of Greenbelt. We're simply recognising a straightforward fact of life, if you like, or fact of planning, which is that future local plans will have to reconsider these matters. I mean, a big part of their job. Hence the clarificatory changes that we've suggested by way of main modifications. We think we've released sufficient Greenbelt land. As you know, there's a strong argument that we've released too much and we shouldn't be releasing any. There's a strong argument that we've released nowhere near enough. We've done what we think is appropriate, and future local plans will review the position when they're brought forward.
Okay.
So,
okay, we'll put a pin in that, because we've got that point now, so we can go back onto the southern areas
onto the southern
issue.
areas, yeah. Okay, in terms of going back to the meaning of sustaining southern competitiveness, what does that mean for the rural economy, and how does what's planned meet MPPF paragraph 84? I've got two other points, if I can
make them all
continue.
at one point.
Okay.
I'm not, yeah.
Paragraph 31 references policies should be underpinned by relevant and up-to-date evidence. We're concerned about the lack of evidence on the environmental aspects and the rural economy, but particularly natural capital, given the intention to protect and enhance natural assets. And we know that natural capital assessments have been done by each of the districts, so it's we don't understand why none of that information has found its way in to this document as evidence. And then the final point is that this plan is for a period of 16 or 17 years, depending on what's agreed. So when the policy suggests that GM will seek to identify opportunities to protect and enhance the natural and historic environments, does it actually mean, given the plan period, does it actually mean identify and take action to protect and enhance those assets? And if so, will it do it in collaboration with local residents?
Okay.
Thank you.
I think one point there, obviously, you're again, I think we're talking about two things. One is, what does the policy say? And again, are you objecting to what the policy says about those things? Or are you, again, objecting to or commenting on how you think it will be implemented and whether or not that will be satisfactory? Which I'm not saying is the wrong thing, I just want to understand in terms of what the words of this policy say.
I think if I go to the last one first, I think the wording about the protection, identifying opportunities to protect and enhance natural and historic environments, if that's all we're planning to do during the planned period of 16 years, then I'm not happy with the wording.
Okay.
If we're actually planning to take action as well, then I think we should say so. And I'd like to see that whole process taken in collaboration with local
well, obviously,
residents.
that bit is slightly outside the scope of my
Right,
because that's an action that's got to be taken after the plan is adopted. And
right, okay.
I mean, you could possibly write something into policy in theory, I suppose, but I'm not sure that's how you implement it is unless it's a proposal in this plan. It's not a lot I can say about that, I don't think.
Okay.
Because I suspect the issues on that side of the table will be different, I will let you come back on some of those points now.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, the first main point related to the rural economy, and paragraph 84 of the framework was referred to, which is to the extent it bears upon the point that the planning policy is part of paragraph 84, planning policies should enable, and then it refers to various things that should be enabled concerning the rural economy. And I think the point is that there's no particular mention of the rural economy in the southern areas strat policy. And as I've explained previously, this plan is setting, by and large, a strategy. It isn't comprehensive. It's not doing all of the heavy lifting, or as I said on the first day, it's doing quite a bit of it. It's not doing all of it. And it'd be for future local plans to pick up the rest of the heavy lifting, so to speak. And as I have said earlier, the references in the framework to what planning policy should do should not be taken too literally and should not be applied literally when one's dealing with a plan like this, which is not a typical single local plan setting out everything that needs to be done for a single local planning authority area. This is more of a strategic plan, as we know, setting a strategy across the 9 areas in question. And so, no, it doesn't drill down, if you like, to picking up each and every point set out in the framework for planning policies in local plans, because there would be a good deal of policies in future local plans on such matters. So that's my response to it. To the point, forgive me. As for environmental aspects and so on not having been properly considered, well, we've been through this in the sense that we've had our integrated assessment involving sustainability appraisal and strategic environmental assessment, as we know. I suspect when we come to the allocations early next year, we'll be picking up the detail of environmental points as we look at each allocation in turn. And as for the last paragraph of the policy in Strat 9, as I mentioned earlier on, it's one of those paragraphs that we're going to go away and think about in the sense that the points captured in it are dealt with elsewhere in the plan, and they're not particularly unique points about the southern areas that need to be particularly singled out in a policy like this, it seems to us on reflection. But we'll wait also for your action points on this, obviously, to see whether you would like us to do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I could just make one quick point about the rural strategies. If the rural economy, if the green belt is released as part of this process, then already the rural economy has been impacted. So if we are pushing it down the road to the local plans to look at the rural economy, then we should be also pushing the allocations down the road to the local plans, because they will affect.
Again, that's not relevant to the southern areas, but it's a general point I think you would make about the northern areas, about everything else. So I think I've got the council's answer to that. So I'll leave it there. Okay, I can't see the nameplate down at the end, so if people can make sure they point them in my direction, that'd be great. Thank you. So we'll start with Eden Planning.
Thank you. Poppy Oakey from Eden Planning, instructed by Moorland Capital No. 1 Limited. Our main point has already been picked up on, in that the policy is generic and similar to policy JP Strat 6, despite the different economic aspirations of the plan for the southern and northern areas. So I won't go into those matters further. Policy JP Strat 9 is intended to provide a strategic framework for placemaking in the southern areas, including the preparation of future local plans. However, for the policy to be effective, the wording needs to be more detailed and specific to the southern areas. In our view, the policy should clearly set out both the short and long-term economic aspirations for the southern areas, including the delivery from New Carrington. So it provides a tangible basis against which future delivery can be monitored, and if necessary, to inform whether additional sites need to be identified through the local plan stage to help achieve these economic aspirations, as could now be allowed through the main modification. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Barton Wilmore.
Thank you, sir. Ian Gilbert here from Barton Wilmore, representing Redrow Homes. Apologies, sir, I wasn't here yesterday. I haven't seen the YouTube channel, and I realised that some of these points have been taken up previously. But I've got 3 points in order of importance. The part of the policy that talks about the prioritisation of brownfield land, the MPPF at paragraph 119 sets out that plans should make as much use as possible of brownfield land. not the prioritisation of brownfield land. And I note the GMCA's comments in essence that no one could argue that it's a bad thing to prioritise brownfield land. And I'd like to argue the opposite, sir, that in the council's matter 5.10, it sets out the two purposes of this strategic policy to provide strategic justification for the allocations in Chapter 11 and to steer the future local plans. And in both of those scenarios, the prioritisation of brownfield land is a problem. We make representations in Matter 23 about New Carrington, but in essence, that policy looks to take a prioritisation of brownfield land over greenfield land, but allocates both, and in essence phases greenfield parts of the allocation out of the local plan period, which for the reasons we've set out in that statement is a problem. And in terms of the preparation of local plans and steering those local plans, the NPPF, like I said, is clear that we want to maximise and use as well as and as much as possible of brownfield land. It doesn't advocate, in essence, a sequential approach to greenfield and brownfield land. The second point is about the balance of policy Strat 9 and the economic competitiveness of the southern areas and their protection and enhancement. Our points are made against question 5.12, so, and you have those comments, but I think the only point I'd raise in addition to what the council has said is that their supporting text of the policy at 4.58 and at 4.63 of the plan provides a very balanced view, in my view, of the southern areas in terms of the need for the maintenance of competitiveness, balanced with the regeneration of the parts of the southern area that need them, and the policy doesn't reflect that balance. So we've asked in our statements to have further reference to regeneration of areas that require it, which obviously goes on to be dealt with in the New Carrington policy, but this policy, Strat 9, is, in my view, supposed to paint a picture of the southern areas, and it misses out half, or part of. And point 3, sir, is on the text that refers to the Greenbelt release being dealt with in Chapter 11. We don't have any problem with that modification, sir. The fact that the plan is clear that the Greenbelt allocations it speaks of is in Chapter 11. But what is clear to us is, well, not clear, but what seems to be an issue is that the plan is being misread or misunderstood in terms of what it purports to do in steering the local plans. And it is unclear as to whether or not it means that it's trying to restrict or encourage them not to release further greenbelt land, albeit I take the point that it couldn't, but that's the plan needs to be written for everyone to read, not experts in planning. And the fact that it needs clarification, so I think is evidence enough that it should be clarified in the plan for lay readers. That's it, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. You'd both put your signs down if you're not speaking. Emery, please.
Thank you, sir. Just a brief point, again, in relation to the prioritisation of previously developed land, and apologies, I also wasn't able to observe yesterday's session.
Sorry, I assumed you were here. I beg your pardon.
Had a break. I think just to, I'll keep it brief because I'm assuming this was done to death, and I am actually here next Tuesday where it's coming up again on JPS 1. But just in relation to the point about, well, this only relates to plan making and the district local plans, I think as currently drafted, I'm not sure that's sufficiently clear from these policies. But secondly, in any event, I would say that the district local plans, like this plan, they won't actually prioritise previously developed land. They will need greenfield sites, including those inside the urban area, and it may need them to come forward ahead of, or it will need those to come forward ahead of PDL. So I think we maintain our position that the policy should be consistent with national policy and refer to making as much use as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Colliers, please.
Thank you, sir. Paul Tucker on behalf of Royal London. Two very small points, really, and they're editorial points. The first of which relates to the policy itself, the second to the main mods. On the policy itself, we wonder whether there is some degree of clarity that could be added to the second paragraph, which says the economic potential of benefits of investment in ... Manchester Airport, along with associated transport infrastructure, will be maximised. There's no reference to the HS2 station within this policy itself. And it's not altogether clear when one looks at the policy itself whether transport infrastructure is covering the HS2 station or wider transport infrastructure of the sort that's specifically identified in Strat 10. So either a cross-reference to that or even a flagging up of what is a major piece of infrastructure so that it's not downgraded is useful, and that self-evidently supports the debate we'll have about a site that I would have mentioned, but for the fact that I understand there's some sort of fine system about suites, so I'm not going to mention the site again. That's the first point, whether or not one can improve the policy in simply adding HS2 or a cross-reference to the associated infrastructure in Strat 10. The second point is on the proposed mod. I'm not sure what the word "as" is adding to the sentence, because it grammatically, the grammarian in me, if you've got the word "as" before identified, it's suggesting that could be an example, and that's plainly not what's been intended. So will be complemented by improvements transport connectivity local ... in key locations identified in Chapter 11, and that's my role as editor. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, a few points there for the council to come back on. But I would like just in particular, and I'm sorry it does go back to the whole numbers game where we've had to talk about this, is that a lot of the discussion yesterday, in fairness, was about housing and the northern areas and totting up all the housing numbers into the northern northern areas. Of course, I think the point, I'm not saying it's not just about housing, but not just about employment land, but of course the point about employment land is there is no district level figures, and so from a local plan perspective, this is just sort of clarifying in mind how would councils be able to sort of go about determining what level of employment land they might need? I mean, yeah, from that point, if that makes sense. So that's one of the points.
It makes
but then
absolute sense. I don't think that was a point raised, but I'm very happy to deal with it. I know it's a thought that's occurred to you.
That's what I'm here to do.
No, absolutely, absolutely, sir. Great. Well, can I just tackle that? Forgive me, I've rather lost the sort of thread of what's coming, but we're returning, aren't we, to employment matters on a future day?
Yes, we are, next Wednesday.
Great.
So we can talk about...
Can I put a marker down that we'll talk about it then? Because we have ourselves, believe it or not, asked ourselves the very same question about
and probably, believe it or not, I was going to ask a very similar question next Wednesday.
So how is Places for Everyone going to steer the future local plans vis-à-vis economic development? We know it does vis-à-vis housing development, and the question arises, well, how do you sort of unscramble what's said in PFE and take it forward as one of the 9 making a local plan? It's a very good question, and we've got an answer to it, but I'm not going to give it now because it involves getting out various documents and talking you through to explain the position. So if you don't mind, and I'm going to make
that
myself
would probably be sensible. I mean, I don't know if obviously the relevant parties are there, but it would probably be sensible because I don't want to get into a whole employment land discussion when we're talking about this one policy.
There is, to put it very briefly indeed, but it does need proper explanation, and I'm not, I could do it now, but I'd much rather do it when we're looking at economic matters across the piece. But to put it very briefly indeed, there is a way in which one can understand from Places for Everyone how much economic development is meant to be taken forward by each of the 9 authorities in making local plans. There is a way of doing that, but, being very straightforward, as I hope I've been throughout, it isn't clearly explained in this document how that process works, and it needs to be clearly explained. And there's no doubt at all in our minds that we need to add something to this plan to explain how it's meant to work vis-à-vis economic development, because there's a way in which one can understand for each local plan this is how much you're meant to take forward, as far as we're concerned, places for everyone's concerned. But it isn't clearly set out in the plan, hence your question, sir, and you've touched on this, I think, a few times over the course of this.
Something I've been building up to next week.
Absolutely, yes. Well, so there is an answer, but I will, put my hands up straight away and say, the innocent abroad, if you like, reading this plan would need an understanding of it, which isn't clearly set out in the words, and it needs to be. So if you will forgive me, just summarising the point in that way, parking it, because it will fit much better when we come to deal with economic matters more broadly. So if you don't mind just waiting until next week.
Yeah, I think it's a broader point, actually. I was saying in the context of what the point was made about wanting to demonstrate, identify what the aspiration is for the southern area. I think it all flows from that point anyway. So obviously there might be some, depending on how the discussion goes and what the outcome is. Obviously there might be implications for various things, but we'll put a pin in that, I think, for now.
Yes.
I'm now worried that next Wednesday we've only got half a day, whether that's going to be long enough.
Don't worry, sir. When I get to it's only because, to be quite frank, we need a person in the team who isn't here at the moment to just take you through 2 or 3 steps. I could do it, and I may well do it myself, but I just don't want to.
Well, the other thing is, if we do it today, we've got to do it again next week anyway.
Exactly.
So I think we'll do it next week, because I think it's tangential in a way to this policy, but it might be relevant.
No. But you've touched on it a few times, sir, and it's, I've been sitting here wondering when's the moment going to arise when we take it.
Foreshadowing, I think is the word, isn't it?
Take it by the scruff of the neck and deal with it. So, right, that's good. So I shall make sure I get my notes ready for next week on that. So just rewinding to the points that were made around the room, on the other side of the room, forgive me. The prioritisation of the reuse of, strong emphasis on prioritising the reuse of brownfield land. Forgive me, but I'm going to say it again, but I'll put it in this way. I think the Secretary of State would be very, very surprised indeed to find in a report from planning inspectors that it is not an appropriate strategy to have a strong emphasis on prioritising the reuse of brownfield land. I mean, it's just ludicrous, frankly. It's obviously consistent with the framework to have such a strong emphasis on that prioritisation, and it's most certainly, and this is the acid test, I'm afraid, sorry to have to say it again, but the acid test is whether it's an appropriate strategy. Yes, of course it is an appropriate strategy. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. A couple of gentlemen raised that point. As for whether or not what was described as the very good balance struck in paragraphs 4.58 and 4.63 in the supporting text is fully reflected in Strat 9 itself, for example, should there not be a specific reference to New Carrington. I made the point earlier that New Carrington has its own Strat 11 policy. You're obviously meant to read these policies together. We'll wait to see what you tell us in due course about this, Frank. If it needs a few words to be added to it in order to make it sound, which of course is the test, then you'll tell us that. We don't have a strong view one way or the other on it. As for whether there's sufficient clarity vis-à-vis future green route releases and this is a Barton Wilmore point, and the fear that was expressed or the concern that was expressed that this plan might be read as seeking in some way to constrain, discourage, limit the future room for manoeuvre of future local plans to release the green belt. Well, as far as we're concerned, our proposed modification that we've previously discussed, the one that refers to future local plans considering whether there are exceptional circumstances, is perfectly clear on the point. And there is a limit, isn't there, to how much one needs to spell out the absolutely obvious in plans, and I think we've reached it, frankly. What's one supposed to say? We really mean what we say, that is for future local plans to consider whether or not there are exceptional circumstances. to release the green belt. I mean, we've done enough as far as we're concerned. Moving on to Emery's points, now that was the PDL point again, there was a fear, though, that it wasn't sufficient, a concern that the policy wasn't sufficiently clear in explaining that this is a plan-making policy, not a development management policy. And so we previously discussed, I think it was yesterday, whether there's a need to add a sentence. I think you raised the point yourself, didn't you, as to whether there's a need.
I queried whether it was necessary. Yeah. We haven't come to a view on that, obviously.
Exactly. So you'll give us a view on that in due course. It may well be that an additional sentence should be added saying these are plan-making policies. They're not development management policies. So it may well be that's where we end up. But we'll wait for you to tell us what you think about that in due course. And as for my own friend Mr. Tucker's points, no reference to the HS2 state, we'll wait for you to tell us whether that's necessary in order to make the plan sound. I can't imagine we'd have a strong view one way or the other on it. As for the deletion of the word as, I suspect we might put it on our list of other modifications as opposed to one which is necessary to make the plan sound. But thank you. If only I'd had you at my shoulder when we were looking at all these blessed words.
Thank you. Just going back to I think the points, if I may, again, play devil's advocate, but the points I think they've made on this side of the table about the prioritisation of brownfield land wasn't necessarily saying that it was a ludicrous strategy, but more that those words could be misinterpreted or interpreted differently when local plan authors are authoring, and it may end up with perhaps unintended consequences, but unintended consequences in terms of how those plans are drawn up. I think that's the points perhaps are being made.
The intended consequence is that when local plans are drawn up, which are dealing with the southern areas, there should be a strong emphasis on prioritising the reuse of brownfield land, and that's a perfectly appropriate thing to do. I'm sorry.
There's no danger that they're going to exclude needed greenfield land if greenfield land were indeed needed.
Well, how could
on
they?
that basis?
How could they?
I think
that's my answer. I'm sorry. Yeah. I pose it as a question, but I don't.
I don't answer questions.
I don't see how they could. So they have brownfield, they have greenfield land, they have needs. They assess whether or not they have whatever they need in order to meet those, whether they've sufficient allocation, sufficient supply to meet their needs. To the extent there isn't, there is a strong emphasis on prioritising the reuse of brownfield land. If the strong emphasis on prioritising the reuse of brownfield land doesn't work for whatever reason, because there's not enough of it, or it won't deliver in time, and they need therefore to look at greenfield land, or there are other wider sustainability issues that lead them to greenfield land over brownfield land, so be it. I mean, that's their job, that's their task. But there is nothing wrong at all. I mean, as I said, I'm sorry to put it this way, but genuinely, it is the Secretary of State's framework after all. The Secretary of State would be surely extraordinarily surprised to find anyone saying that it's inconsistent. It isn't an appropriate strategy to want to strongly emphasise prioritising the reuse of brownfield land.
Okay, thanks. I'll probably put that one to bed until Tuesday.
Yes, I'm sure I'll be saying something similar on Tuesday.
Okay.
Obviously, if you have a contrary view, or tell us in your report in due course.
Any other comments on Strat 9 before we thank you, Barton Wilmore?
So not to labour the point, I think what we're suggesting is that we use the Secretary of State's exact phrase from the NPPF paragraph 119 rather than a twist on it. So.
I deal with that. It's a perfectly sensible line of thought, if I might say, but this is where in our current system, which is set out in the definition of soundness in paragraph 35, we have consistency with national policy. It doesn't mean in our current system that local authorities have no room to put their own spin on matters, to use the analogy that was made just now. As you know, in the planning reforms, there are suggestions that in future development management policies will be set out simply and solely in the framework. But here, under our current system, the situation is that one of the tests of soundness is consistency with national policy. To be consistent with national policy, one doesn't, obviously if you use exactly the same words, then by definition you are consistent with national policy, but you are not constrained to using exactly the same words. You can have your own local view on how to take forward national policy at local level. And that's what we're dealing with currently.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. We'll leave it. I think we'll leave it there. So if no other comments on Strat 9, I'm going to move on to the Manchester Airport Strat 10 policy. Where to start? Right. Some of my points may have already been picked up, but I'm going to go through it as orderly as I can, I think, go through aspects of the policy. And with a mind to particularly what, and in fact, I think my first question really is, with a mind to what you've said these policies are for, particularly with a local plan perspective, perhaps again it would be useful to explain how this policy is going to take it forward, because one of the things I'm slightly confused about, and I've obviously set this out in some of the questions we asked, is, you know, there's a lot of criteria, and again we're in the same position where some of them are committed, some of them are ideas, some of them are proposals, and the status of them are always very different. And I suppose I've struggled to think, well, how is this manifesting itself through a local plan and as an effective policy? What is it a local plan will actually say about Manchester Airport? Perhaps just as a start of a 10.
Thank you, sir. If we take it back one step, the core strategy, as in our adopted local plan, already has specific policies around the airport. For instance, defining the operational area and taking forward various aspects. The policy that's set out in Places for Everyone, again, it comes back to a degree providing suitable hooks for the review of our own core strategy and how we take forward that policy framework that's within that plan into a new local plan, but also to sort of reflect that circumstances have moved on from when that plan was adopted back in 2012. I mean, it is fair to say, and I know we've spoken about this on other strat policies, that there is a degree of perhaps taking away some points to think about with those particular matters that you've started to identify around particular bullet points of transport sort of factors and some various other factors. And I think it would be fair to say that on the basis of the discussion that's sort of taking place over the past couple of days, there are fair points to look at with respect to this policy in that context as well. But notwithstanding that sort of detail, the principle of the policy again certainly fulfills that function of providing us that overall strategic context of how we take forward what we've got within our existing core strategy and the review of that policy framework into the new local plan. And as I say, in terms of then reflecting some of the up-to-date or further updates that have occurred over the years. It's a very, well, as you can appreciate, it's a very dynamic, fluid situation in that part of the world. Particularly around transport issues, because there are many kind of factors sort of coming together, not only in terms of the operation of the airport and the transport matters of accessing into the airport, but obviously clearly HS2 proposals coming through. Colleagues from Trafford will talk about, you know, their allocations they're bringing forward. We will talk about not only the allocation that's proposed adjacent to the airport, but also the allocation up at Wythenshawe Hospital. So there is a very complex sort of situation there in terms of the various factors we have to try and take account. And in essence, this policy is wrestled with that complexity to try and tease out some of the key factors, key points that would be needed to be addressed. But as I say, perhaps there is a degree of reflection that we might need to take away, subject to what comes out from yourselves with respect to an action note.
Thank you. So yeah, okay. So just take that's helpful. I'm going to take some particular words, if you like. I'm going to see what they mean in practice. I like to do that. So we start off with the policy starts referring to maximising the benefits of sustainable growth of Manchester Airport. I think it's the first line. Oh, sorry, continued operation and sustainable growth of Manchester Airport. What does that mean in practice in terms of, again, from a local, like from draft, because there's nothing obviously other than the allocations, as I understand it, other than Timperley Wedge, Medipark and Global Logistics, this plan proposes nothing about Manchester Airport. So the sustainable growth of Manchester Airport presumably has to be taken forward through local plans. So does this plan envisage, it doesn't set any criteria or limitate or what that actually means in practice, does it?
This plan doesn't, but again, I would refer you back to, we have an existing core strategy that does set out policy framework about some of those, or about those aspects with respect to the airport. I'm sure my colleague from the airport may want to pick up some of these points in terms of some of the material that they bring forward in terms of their own documentation. And I know we've done that, and there was a reference to various documentation that's produced by the airport that we've talked about taking out.
We'll talk about that.
But yeah, I'm sure we'll come to that. But nonetheless, those issues are already dealt with in terms of planning policy with respect to core strategy. And as I say, we're bringing forward, we are very much on with a review of our own local plan, part of which will look at the existing policy and how we may either need to adjust that, reflect that in terms of what we've set out in PFE, but also prevailing circumstances in terms of the airport operations.
So the local plan will, at least in theory, you've got one, you've drafted another, but in theory that will identify, or could identify, what it will, if you like, quantify, qualify what the phrase in this policy means in practice. That's the point. So this plan, that's the upshot of it. So you will determine what continued operation sustainable growth looks like.
Yes.
And write that into your
yeah, I mean, this comes back to, this is the policy hook, again, the sort of strategic policy hook that we then take forward with the detail that's necessary into our own local plan.
Plus, the first part of this needs to be read with what follows the bullet points, it seems to me, just looking at this. Perhaps as someone who isn't so close to Manchester Airport as the council itself, but if you just read this, so it seeks to maximise the benefits of continued to operate sustainable growth of Manchester Airport and its surrounding locality, one scratches one's head and wonders, as you have, what's that mean? Well, read on. Where we're told that the airport's to be the United Kingdom's principal international gateway outside London. The airport and its surrounding locality will make a major contribution to the competitiveness of the North and indeed Midlands and Wales by supporting all sorts of investment, trade, tourism and so on and so forth. So I think, I mean, obviously one's always told to read these plans as a whole, and I think here we might not only read, I wouldn't just say read this policy as a whole. I'd say read the first part of the policy in together with what follows the bullet points.
But as far as, again, I'm trying to pick it up from if you like, the first users of this policy are the districts. So you've obviously been part of this plan as well. So you probably would say, but again, the lack of specificity about what it means. Like again, numbers or a policy which said the local plans will ensure the delivery of X square metres of this type of floor space in this particular location is not in any way a lack of effectiveness of this plan from your perspective.
No, we don't view that as an issue.
And you're clear. You think that paragraph and the criteria below it set out a clear framework for what you think a local plan should include in terms of land use provision, and gives you the hook to know what the airport should include in terms of land use.
Yes, and again, I mean, we do mention about the context of the local plan policies. There is detail within our current core strategy that we can bring forward. So it's a combination of what's set out in terms of the strategic aspect, the hook that's in this plan, plus what we bring in terms of...
Just in terms of time, so the core strategy is, you've got an adopted core strategy.
Yep.
That exists. Presumably your emerging local plan will supersede that in some way. So,
yes.
So, and without looking at Appendix A, one assumes that this plan is not superseding the relevant core strategy policy. No. So there's going to be there's a policy in place, whatever.
Yeah.
So,
and we have thought about that, sir. Yes. Yeah. We're not going to be caught by the joys of identifying a policy that we've decided to take out.
Okay, thank you. There's several references in, I think, the supporting text, in particular, maybe in the policy, sort of again in the what I like to call the purple prose of what you're hoping to achieve about passenger number growth. And again, there have been representations talking about that aspect. You know, the plan is promoting passenger number growth and the sustainability implications of that. Just my understanding again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this plan isn't proposing a particular growth in. I've taken it because there's nothing set out. It's reflecting what either can happen. Again, from reading the support text, it's what can happen anyway, or what is already committed. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's reflecting probably more what can happen necessarily. I mean, clearly we've had a situation in the past 2 years that's led to a somewhat different interpretation of what passenger growth might look like over a time span. But nonetheless, there clearly is an intention or an assumption around a continuation of passenger growth with respect to the operations of that.
And is that existing capacity, as in without, you know, not necessarily needing new facilities or new infrastructure? That there's capacity within the existing airport to increase passengers, you know, just as a matter of course.
I'm very mindful. I've got a colleague from the airport who might want to sort of provide.
I'm just trying to understand again what the local plan or what this plan,
Yeah.
what the local plan should have to do to achieve that. And is it? I'm trying to get my head around. Is it a proposal? Is it a matter of fact? Is it reflecting what's happening anyway? That's all I want.
Yeah, in essence, it's reflecting what's happening anyway. But nonetheless, there's the comfort that the airport, and as I say, my colleague from the airport will no doubt make a couple of points on this. That there is that sort of, or the facilities are there, and or very recently in terms of new facilities that are coming on stream, in terms of the new Terminal 2, for instance, the capacity is effectively built in, and or where there's a need for further sort of operational aspects, that will be dealt with if needed through the update of the local plan.
And also, so I mean, you've picked up references in the supporting text, I think, which are expressed in language such as could see throughput growing to ... And you'll see that there are, throughout the supporting text, there are cross-references to where these points are drawn from. And in any event, that's the supporting text. The policy itself doesn't, unless I've missed it, say anything specific about
No, it doesn't. I think yes, that's the point. Yeah.
So, without wanting to be legalistic about this, I mean, every now and again the law in me comes out just for a few seconds, and you'll understand obviously the difference between the supporting text and the policies. So,
indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Understand a little bit more about that. We're going to go through some of the specific, again, more specifics, and some of the mods that quite a few mods suggested to this one. We'll start off with the, as you point out, the end of the first paragraph, development which is in line with government policy, Manchester's local plan policies, and the airport group's corporate social responsibility strategy. That's what the policy says. We questioned the status of the CSRS, and you have now suggested removing that. Perhaps you want to explain why you're suggesting that. Just.
I think, primarily because it's not really a document that is of great utility for this plan to speak of in relation to future plan making. I think there was, from memory, also a point about whether the document itself has moved on from the one that we referred to, but I'll leave that point. I might have got that the wrong way around. But no, it's just basically because it didn't seem to be of a similar ilk to, and plainly isn't of a similar ilk to, government policy and local plan policies. So it's just trying to weed out something which isn't really strictly planning policy per se. Yeah.
Which I think, I'd agree with that in principle. I think I can safely say on that one. But the only thing I would say is obviously must have been a reason why the GMCA thought it was important to refer to that, and I think in some of the responses to our questions there was sort of setting out, and maybe the airport group set it out as well. It includes certain things that they consider to be important. What I suppose in terms of an effectiveness perspective, what I would just make sure that there's no baby being thrown out with the bathwater, and there's some kind of key policy aim that should be in that policy, which isn't, which would no longer be in the policy, and that you'd be losing. You know, if, for example, you're basically using that document as a shortcut to some important policy issue, and that would go, and therefore the policy is no longer effective. I just want to make sure where we stand on that.
Well, I would say that there are other policies in places for everyone.
I assume that's the case. Yeah, I just wanted to check. There's nothing that you were saying that's absolutely critical, and it will no longer be there. But I think there's things about corporate carbon neutrality and things.
Exactly. We've got lots of controversial stuff about that. So yes.
We have indeed. Well, you have. So I will just ask. I think at that point I will pause because just say if there is any comments on that particular point from the airport, whether or not removing that part of the policy causes any particular issues from a soundness perspective.
Thank you, sir. Andrew Murray, Manchester Airport Group. I think it's fair to say that when this policy was written, there wasn't a national policy in place that obligated airports to be carbon neutral by a particular date. So effectively, we were forerunning national policy in that regard. We've now got a Jet Zero policy strategy from government that contains an obligation for airports as pieces of infrastructure to be carbon neutral by 2040. Our CSR commitment is by 2038, so we're still ahead of the national game anyway. So I think that was the reason for it being included. It was to say that the airport would develop in line with its objective to be carbon neutral by 2038.
Thank you. Any comments on that? I just wanted to maybe get that view. Okay, we'll move on. Yes. Sorry. Yes, there was a point about. Obviously, we've talked about. I suppose if you take out the reference to the CSRS development, which is in line with government policy, and Manchester's local plan will be supported. Maybe seems like a statement of the obvious, but whether it's unsound or not,
Exactly.
I might need to.
Yes.
I'm not sure where I want to go through that. So criteria 1 to 5. Actually, I might flick between because some of the mods will come out of the discussion on criteria, but because some of the ones on 1 to 5 are adding cross references, aren't they?
That's right.
They're not changing the essence.
No,
they're just trying to.
They're just signposting where these figures have come from.
Yeah, but on criteria 1 to 5, I think the first refers to the 500,000 square metres as office, logistics, hotel and advanced manufacturing space. So, and you're want to refer people to JPA 10 and the Manchester local plan on that. So JPA 10, I think, is for 25,000 square metres. So is that, just for clarity, does the local plan identify requirements for the other 475? Or again, is this a little bit like Port Salford, where we've got a mix of stuff that's happened, stuff that's going to happen, I suppose what's the relevance of the local plan in that cross-reference?
It's probably more relevance in terms of development applications that have happened since the local plan, the core strategy, was adopted. So in essence, the core strategy set out the approach with respect to what we call Airport City, and also the release of Greenbelt to an area that's the original sort of global logistics development that in effect they've either come through as planning, they're committed in the sense of planning permissions or actual physical development. Off the top of my head, I would need to double check the precise numbers in terms of what's come through, but in essence, in principle, it's that approach.
So this isn't new, is what I'm trying to. It's not. A local plan would have to identify land for 500,000 square metres of new, 475,000 square metres.
No. I mean, in essence,
new floor space.
In essence, what we're looking for in terms of new is what's then set out in terms of the new global logistics, which is within JPN 10. So
I think I just get into my head about these things. Where this again says completing the development of Airport City, and I think yesterday Port Salford was a similar sort of form of words. It's painting a picture of what life will be like once it's all done. but I sort of put myself in the local plan author's shoes again and think, what am I being asked to do here?
Yeah.
Am I being asked to do anything?
Yeah. Well, you're talking to the local plan author.
Exactly.
So.
Are you being asked to do anything? Yeah.
So in that sense, no. I mean, you can never say never, but nonetheless, as I've said it out, it's essentially what's come through from the core strategy and what's there in terms of committed and or built development plus the JPA.
So it's not asking you to do anything.
No.
Basically. Okay, that's good. Well, it's not good necessarily, but I understand at least. Do you think, again, from a kind of effectiveness perspective, is that helpful to have that in there? Really?
I think maybe some of this is an evolution of policy, and bearing in mind that this plan has been in gestation for a number of years. So there are aspects of this policy that perhaps were reflecting circumstances as they were some while back, and yes, events are moving on. So whether it's a die in the ditch sort of aspect of the policy, no, probably not.
No, I would say it's about interpretation, isn't it? And what if you understand it, does everybody else understand it?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll leave that for now. In the modification, just again for completeness of my understanding, where you've said whatever we do about this criterion, but C policy JP10, that's fine, we understand that, and the Manchester local plan. Obviously, you're just presumably referring to whichever Manchester local plan happens to be adopted at the time. Is that the case?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, clearly, whichever plan, the extant plan, basically. Okay. Yeah.
Fair enough. In your answer to, or I think maybe in Manchester Airport Group's answer to question 5.14, which I think again was me talking about the numbers and everything, they refer to the development of the World Freight Terminal, or redevelopment of the World Freight Terminal. Again, just for my understanding, I just wanted to understand whether the numbers, because I think there's some potential increase in numbers there, or rationalisation of numbers there. Is that all part of that airport city 500,000 square metre type figure? Is it all ensconced within Criterion 1?
As far as I'm aware, yes. Again, we would double check just to make absolutely clear, but my understanding is yes.
Yeah, it's not. Is it something different that needs referring to? I'll say no. Okay. So, no requirement there. I haven't got a lot to say about the other mods on 1 to 5, apart, well, 1, 2, 3 and 4, because they're just literally cross-referencing. On the last one, providing sufficient development opportunity to take full advantage of the introduction of HS2 and MPR. Again, so I've lost my place. Yeah, I suppose it's whether or not it's clear. What does that, again, it's coming back to what does that mean to you as local plan authors about, is it clear what you're being expected to do? What would be sufficient development opportunities? Are they in the plan? Have they been identified? Is that what Timperley Wedge and Medipark are? Are they the sufficient development opportunities?
Yes. However, the hybrid bill for HS2 is still currently working its way through the House of Parliament, and it's not yet fully at the stage where we can categorically say what it is going to look like, and in whether it's going to include full MPR, core MPR, or indeed any other version or iteration of MPR that may come forward. So this is more of a, because at the time of writing the publication, obviously the bill hadn't even been deposited to Parliament. So this is much more of an aspirational criteria, which will allow both Trafford and Manchester to, through their local plans, take advantage of whatever the situation on the ground at the time of those coming forward may or may not be. We have a fairly good indication at the stages of what that might include with regards to the HS2 proposals. but there's still a lot of question marks around the delivery, the timing, the phasing, and what the detail of those might come forward. So this particular this particular criteria allows us that hook to be able to provide further guidance and further detailed matters through the local plan at the time of writing.
And could that, again, in theory, mean more greenbelt release, or, I mean, greater, more scale of development than you've already proposed, so potentially greenbelt release? Or
Potentially, yes, but it's not the intention at this moment in time. That will very much have to depend upon housing, well, not housing needs, but the needs and requirements that are being derived and sought from and expected of HS2. We haven't seen investment of this nature or scale before in the north in a very long time, so it is somewhat of an unknown category.
Okay, thanks.
And I should also, mention that within the Timperley Wedge allocation, there is an area of safeguarded land which we have at Trafford set aside should the need arise in the future for development arising out of HS2, and we'll come on to that in January, but we have already thought ahead to that particular scenario.
Thank you. So I jumped to criteria 1 to 5, and I'm jumping back to criteria A to F. The policy states that accessibility and connectivity of the area will be greatly enhanced, including through the implementation of A to F, which sets out a series of infrastructure projects. And we did ask how these criteria intended to be used, either in terms of strategic framework local plans or informing the preparation of, well, we actually said originally a question obviously about development management issues, which you've given us an answer on that. And you concluded that these are projects which will need to be delivered alongside the proposed residential and employment development. So if these need to be delivered alongside the housing and employment development, are they all considered critical to delivery of the plan, or at least delivery of this policy?
The Southern Areas policy isn't reliant upon, in particular, the arrival of HS2, for which a number of these infrastructure and transport initiatives and projects are linked to it. So with regards to the sort of big ticket items of infrastructure that are listed in that, then no, it's not a case of we can't deliver the development requirements and meet the needs in the areas if they don't happen. The plan is predicated on the basis that they aren't there and that they can still come forward without them. Obviously, if they do arrive, there will need to be some sort of agreement and arrangement of phasing and delivery, etc., as to how that actually is worked on the ground. But in terms of what this plan says, it's not predicated on particularly HS2 MPR and the other sort of big ticket items coming forward.
So in terms of the purpose of those criteria in this policy, what are they telling? What are they doing there? Are they asking? Are they expecting local plans again, or decision makers to make sure the policies allow for these, or are they there to tell developers they've got to contribute to these, or are they just sort of again facts?
They're more a list of facts. Some of the schemes in there, such as the Western Leg extension of the Metrolink, is a fact. TSGM have the powers granted to them to construct. That is just not happened yet. So it's more of an indication as to what schemes are anticipated and or committed in the area, which will greatly enhance the connectivity of the southern area. The Manchester Airport area. In particular, we've also got bus reform taking place at the moment through Greater Manchester, where we're taking back control of where the routes run, etc., which will play into criteria D. So it's very much a case of a statement of fact rather and a little bit of aspiration, given the fact that we're not quite sure yet exactly how the government is going to deliver some of the larger infrastructure projects.
Okay. I mean, one of the things I've had with these strategy policies, probably quite obvious from my questions, is trying to clearly in my mind what is a reflection of the great things that are happening in Greater Manchester that you want to tell people about, and the things which need to be in policy to make sure they happen. And I think, just understanding that, at least I'm clearer that mainly it's the former with these. They're not. I suppose the question is, if they weren't listed in this policy, I'm not suggesting that's where we're going to go, but if they weren't listed in the policy, it wouldn't change this outcome. Is that?
No, although I think that the Treasury would be very happy for anyone to contribute to the costs of some of these, but no, it doesn't change the fact.
Okay. Well, then that would be presumably determined when applications came in. You would do your TA and determine what mitigation was required.
Yes, but I probably would stress that with regards to the national infrastructure projects, as far as I'm aware, sitting in lots of meetings on them, I don't believe that any of those are subject or expected to be partly funded by private sector investment at this stage.
And I think yesterday, under a different list of transport schemes, I think it was suggested that they have some use in the policy in terms of maybe making bids for funding. If some kind of funding bid is required, the fact that they're in policy helps, even if they're not required. Is that the same for these as well?
Precisely, yes. Particularly with the CRSTS fund, which forgive me, for the life of me, I can't quite recall what the letters stand for. City Regional Sustainable Transport Supplement. Yeah.
So if again, I've got to think about what the implications are, but in nothing else, they show that Greater Manchester as a whole is supportive of these schemes. Okay. Thank you. I think that covers most of my question of the policy itself. We have a couple of points. I have a couple of comments to make about figures. Figure 4.7. Hurrah. But nothing particularly major on this. Obviously, you've suggested one modification to this to replace, which is a factual thing about Airport City South allocation to refer to global logistics. I think that's, again, that might well be an AM, but if it's all part of the changes. I think the other more substantive one is, again, you've got quite a few of these potential metro tram train links, and and it's that clarity about what they are they illustrative, and whether they should be on there or not. And I think this falls into the same categories we were talking about yesterday, and a lot of, I think, further discussions, once we've been through, because obviously some of these figures relate to other allocations, so once we've been through all of that, I think we can see what needs to be done.
Yes, we've obviously, perhaps it's not obvious, we have been discussing these matters after the sessions, and I think our current inclination would be that we need to introduce some text into the plan to explain what the purpose of showing these things is on these various figures, and in one case a picture, rather than removing them completely. But that's our current line of thought. So to clarify what they're doing on the figures, if you like.
It's nearly 11. It should be time for a break, but I think on the basis that I'm not expecting many points to be raised, we can carry on perhaps and get through this and then have a break then, if that's okay with everyone. So I'll start with any comments, but I will start with colleagues, as that sign's been up a while.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points, if I may. Firstly, on the figure 4.7, you'll have seen from our hearing statement that yes, we think that could be better, and the fact that the text is going to be added would assist our point in that regard, where we ask for a key to be added to the plan. So it's a could do better. So I'm heartened by that. Won't say anything more. In terms of the policy itself, and I raised my Toblerone. There seems to be a confectionery theme to this particular examination. I raised my Toblerone at the point that you, sir, asked whether or not the policy was going to be effective and what it was doing. It's a bit of a portmanteau policy. It's doing a number of different things. I was taught a long time ago that planning is an iterative process, and this is very much an iterative policy doing a number of different things. So, for example, it's not just about the 3 allocations at the end. It's telling you a number of different things that are happening in this area, and Criterion Arabic 5 is telling you that the intention of the authorities is to take full advantage of the introduction of all the things that are happening, some of which may come to fruition, some of which may not come to fruition, But if they do come to fruition, it will be irresponsible of the public sector not to take full advantage of those. So, by way of example, the development around HS2 becomes important to make sure that one is taking advantage of that, both in relation to the relationship to the airport, but also other aspects of that. The policy doesn't just inform plan making. In terms of the next stage, it will inform a whole series of different things. We've heard it will inform funding. It will inform how HS2 comes forward. So the fact that the public authorities are saying this is what we're doing in this area tells those who are formulating the plans behind the scenes as to how it comes forward, as to what the aspirations are. Simple things such as crossing the motorway. Do you need just a continuation of the existing infrastructure or something more required? And those that are preparing bills will no doubt be mindful of the fact that there is this aspiration in relation to this policy to inform that as well. It's also got development management elements to it, and I draw particular attention to D and E in relation to the part 2 of this multi-part policy, so that if there is development that's coming forward, looking at E, there will be a requirement to improve public transport services and connections, taking advantage of all the different things that are happening in the policy. So it's very much doing a number of different threads as well as setting out the strategy. So in answer to your question, sir, do we think the policy is effective and justified? I am going to say that we agree with the authority, but I'm going to agree for a slightly different reason. We agree it's effective and justified because it's doing that number of different elements, and those other elements will find their way into different aspects, both of plan making and infrastructure provision, and also how allocations, such as the site that shall not be named, comes forward in due course, because that will then be informed by F, a provision of network of cycling and walking routes. Connections to and from Manchester Airport become important, and I would stress in relation to the policy itself that it's also doing two different things in relation to the area, because it's dealing with Manchester Airport itself, things that we heard from the end of the table, but it's also dealing with the surrounding locality, and that's a very important aspect in terms of the policy. So yes, strongly supported in terms of effective and justified, heartened by the amendments to the key diagram. Thank you, sirs.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the airport group then, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, again, I want to support that. The policy is justified. National policy in respect of airport development is called Making Best Use of Existing Runways. Adopted in 2018, ratified and confirmed since then following further announcements. It's, however, silent on exactly what that means. And I think for this plan, it's important to provide a policy hook for the local plan to interpret what that national policy means. So I think that's its value for the airport's point of view. I could go into all manner of different things about how the capacity of an airport is derived. If you want to understand that, more than happy to go into that. But in terms of making best use of existing runways, in the current configuration, it's probably around about 55 million passengers a year, which sees us well into the 2040s, 50s.
So and that's so. Without, you might need some operational development, but you're not talking about massive expansion to achieve what's being talked about in the sporting text.
Absolutely not. No, I mean we've got the capacity is a mixture of the ability of the airspace to accommodate more aircraft, the space on the ground to park aircraft, the ability of the buildings to process passengers to get on those aircraft, and then the surrounding infrastructure to allow people to get to the airport to get on those aircraft. So it's a complicated factor of all of those different 5 elements. And the runways themselves, like I say, in their current configuration, could probably deliver about 55 million passengers a year. Moot point as to whether or not all those other 4 could deliver that.
Okay, thank you. One point, while I've got you, you in your statements you talked about defining the operational area in the policy or on the map, I believe. I don't know if you want to. I haven't asked about it, but if there's anything you want to particularly raise about that.
No, I mean the point I was making is that it would be useful for this plan to basically instruct the local plan making authority, that that was a good policy tool to restrict development that didn't need to be at the airport and thereby enable the airport to meet its capacity, but then also direct development that does need to be at the airport into the operational area. Just thought it'd be a useful pointer to have in this policy.
Okay. I will ask the council what they think about that. Thank you. Barton Wilmore.
Thank you, sir. This was a point I was going to raise about figure 4.8, but it responds to the GMCA's point about adding some text to be helpful. So it might be relevant now, sir.
Yeah.
That to clarify what the purpose of the figures are and what's included and what's not, we were going to suggest using the council's own text in addition to their. They were going to add text to paragraph 4.22 in chapter 4, and the explanation in the council's own justification for that additional text goes on to read that the policies do not set specific requirements to be taken forwards in local plans or inform the preparation of or determination of planning applications. If that additional text was added and the policies and figures were mentioned, that would provide the clarity that I think we need, so we're not going to end up contributing with Section 106 requirements for these points and figures.
Okay, thank you. And Save the Greater Manchester Greenbelt. Thank you.
Just a quick point. We've heard how busy this policy is. I think just to reflect something that we did talk about yesterday, it's about how it's going to be measured, and particularly how sustainable growth is going to be measured, and that whole issue of sustainability throughout the policy. So particularly when we're looking at how it's measured for 5-year reviews and other aspects.
Thank you very much. So come back on those points. Thank you. What's some of those points?
Yes, thank you. Just working backwards while it's fresh in my mind, the point just made about how one measures, how well or badly one's doing, if you like, over time. So as I mentioned yesterday, we're somewhere along the line. I think later on we're going to have a session, or at least dip into the chapter that sets these various, or perhaps doesn't set these various metrics, and we're looking again at that in preparation for that session. So,
Yeah, so as I say, I mean,
story short.
Sorry, beg your pardon. We are obviously thinking about when best to deal with that.
Yes.
Because it's coming up under a lot of different individual policies, so we just need to work out what's the best way of wrapping it up.
Rather, if I may put my little plea in, I'd rather we dealt with it perhaps traditionally one would deal with these issues at the end of the hearings. It's usually the last, in my experience anyway, it's usually the last thing, because it's the last chapter normally, about monitoring. So it would be helpful from our point of view if it was later rather than sooner, because we are looking at the entire chapter and whether or not it would be useful to introduce some more specific metrics to cover some of these points that have been raised, not only by your good selves, but also by speakers. So I think if we dealt with this, I don't know, say, for example, just to take an instance off the top of my head, if we dealt with it next week, it'd be too soon for us, to be quite frank, because we'd like to look at this properly, put something, as we discussed yesterday, put something in so it's publicly available, etc.
We're obviously,
if you could take that away,
we're taking that away, and we'll come back at some point about what we think is best.
That was that. So,
as I say, some of it's falling out of the individual policies. It's a logical place to talk about it, but then obviously if it starts to become, there's a lot, and it might be sensible to draw it all together.
Absolutely, and I think the point is going to come up a lot, isn't it? It's already come up a few times, and it's bound to keep coming up, and it's a perfectly sensible point, if I might say. So we've got it.
So I'll just go. Thank you. We won't forget the point. You won't let us forget the point, but we'll definitely make sure that's covered. Obviously, we're looking at the plan as a whole, so some things will be picked up later on. So thank you for that.
And otherwise, I'll just look to my look to my left to see whether there's anything that you wanted to say about the airport's point about having some more specific text in the policy about things that need to be at the airport should be there and things that don't need to be there shouldn't be there, so to speak. I'm summarising crudely, but there you are.
Yeah, I think it's a point well made. Again, there's no specific reason why we wouldn't look to do that. And to a degree, there is a logic to providing that sooner rather than later, rather than waiting for the review of the local plan. So,
what would, in terms of, and I'm not saying, you know, I'm thinking out loud about what that would mean in practice, but is it your position, from what you've heard and what you've seen in the written reps, that you think that the policy is ineffective because it doesn't cover that? Is it a nice to have rather than it needs to have? And what actual, if you were to go down that route of it needs to have, then what kind of actual work's needed to implement it? I'm sure it's not just a case of saying, you know, or is it just a case of putting a line in a policy, or is it there needs to be some evidence behind it?
it's certainly a nice to have. As I say, we've got the definition and the specifics within an existing local plan. So with respect to that, we're not looking to supersede that, albeit that if we did, well, if it's literally one line, then it's not going to supersede what we've already stated. But
sorry, obviously I've not looked in detail at your core strategy, but are the points that are being raised, as far as you're concerned, they're covered by the core strategy already, and which is not being superseded. So it wouldn't.
Yeah, in essence,
so it wouldn't add anything.
Not particularly, unless, well, no, it wouldn't add anything.
Unless you
substantive.
decided through your local plan review to get rid of that idea.
Well, we wouldn't get rid of the idea, that's for sure.
So you're not intended to do that anyway?
No.
Okay. That's helpful. Okay, thank you. Sorry, were there any other points? No, I think, and again, the points made about text to clarify the role of the figures. We've got those points. I think there's a few things to come through on that at some point. Have I missed anything? No, I don't think so, unless anyone could tell me I'm wrong. No? Any other points on Manchester Airport policy? Excellent, thank you very much. Well, I think I'll have a little adjournment, I think, till past, just over 15 minutes, and then we'll come on to the non-controversial issue of New Carrington and see how far we get. So thank you very much. We'll come back at 11:30. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you everyone. It's 11:30, so we'll make a start. I've just got one point I want to make that fell out of the discussion we've just had, and I know Mr. Katkowski wants to make a point. Mr. Phil, reminded me, we were talking about your maybe next Wednesday, the employment land issues. It occurred to me yesterday we talked about if there's anything that we need to see.
That was my point.
Oh, was the point? Yeah. So, that if there is anything we need to see, if we could get it, I mean, preferably sooner rather than later.
Yes,
but if we could
absolutely.
get it no later than midday at 12, midday on Tuesday, I think that would be.
Well, I would hope that we'd do better than that, but yes,
Okay.
sir, certainly.
Thank you.
No, that was my very point, was to
Okay.
ask you whether.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know obviously what you're proposing to do in terms of what,
Well, no,
what's going to include,
there's a
but
note.
any information that we've got that everyone can see.
Absolutely.
At least we'll have something to talk.
And it's going to be easier to read it, frankly, than me trying to explain it and pretend that I'm doing it off the cuff, because I won't be. I'll be reading a note, or referring to a note. So, absolutely. So we'll put the note in, hopefully on Monday, but certainly no later than the deadline you've given us. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for that. Good. Right. So then, unless there are any other procedural issues or anything that I need to pick up, I'm going to move on to JP Strat 11, New Carrington. As with Port Salford and I think to a lesser degree the airport, because obviously it refers to other allocations, but in a more factual way. Port Salford and New Carrington are quite unusual in that they are mainly about an allocation in the plan, and I think the New Carrington Strat 11 policy is unique, as far as I can tell. It refers to nothing else other than the allocation in the plan, and as I read it, and as I read the evidence and read the response to our questions, I think this policy is slightly different to many Strat policies in that it seems to have no role, unless I'm told otherwise, outside establishing the JPA 33 allocation, because the councils have confirmed to us, I think in response to our questions, that there's no expectation that the Trafford local plan will need to allocate any land to deliver the New Carrington vision. So is that a correct assumption?
Sir, if I could just introduce
Sorry,
myself.
thank you.
My name's Adrian Fisher. I'm from Trafford Council. And yes, that's correct. We're not expecting any further allocation of land.
So I suppose, without getting into, for the moment, the justification for the part of the strategy that talks about New Carrington and everything, I've just explained to me what the role and purpose of this policy actually is then in terms of effect, because we'll probably come on to it at some point either today or certainly in the future about any potential overlap between JPA 33. And so what is this policy doing? Why is it there?
Well, so as I understand it in this, others will add to this or contradict it in a few moments' time, but as I understand it, we have this run of Strat policies here, which then either predominantly have a role for future local plans, or in this particular case is really just a signpost to what's coming later in places for everyone. And just as I understand it, it would just be, if you like, rather odd to be setting out these strategic policies without having some specific mention of New Carrington before you then turn, later on to find the details set out in the allocation policy. Would the plan be any the worse, were one to say it once rather than saying it twice? I don't suppose it would be. Is the plan unsound for saying it twice? No, surely not. So, is it necessary in order to make the plan sound to say something once rather than twice? No, it isn't. So I think we're in that category, to be frank. It's just the sort of structure of the plan that we set out these strategic key points, fairly early on in the plan, and then we find the allocations later on, and it just fits with that approach.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on, can someone just do something with the aircon, because it's it sounds like there's an aeroplane behind my head.
Yes, I'll see once that's switched off whether there are any additional comments to my left on that. No obligation.
Yes, sir. I think it as we've just heard, the scale of Carrington is very significant. you know, that overall it's about 7 or 8 square kilometres in size. The employment element alone is about 2.5 square kilometres. So as soon as you start measuring things in square kilometres rather than hectares, you get a sense of the scale and the impact of this. And I think in terms of the quantum of development and also the land take, it's pretty much the largest allocation in the plan. So it clearly has an implication, of course, for Trafford, but beyond, and for Greater Manchester. So I think it is that the fact that this policy sets that scene, it sets that strategic overview, and it does signal that there are some other points within it, such as the need for integration with adjacent communities, and also transport infrastructure. And some of those are points which, you know, may well be picked up at a local plan stage, depending on the specific circumstances at that time. So it is, you know, but primarily it's there simply because of the scale and the significance of the allocation.
So although you've said you don't anticipate there being any need for local plans to pick anything up from this policy would at least provide you with the hook required, as we're using that phrase. That if it were required, then you've got something to hang it off.
Yeah, in conjunction with JPA 33, which provides obviously a significant amount of detail on the specifics of the allocation together, if necessary, then it does allow us to do that in the future, although we're hoping we don't have to.
Okay, thank you. So that was really talking about, you know, I'm sure others may have some more points to make about why do you need a policy really when you've got an allocation policy? What's it for? I'm a bit clearer on that at least. So turning to some matters of principle, then obviously we talk about matters of principle in our questions. You know, why is this? Is it justified for New Carrington to be a location for significant mixed-use development? That's the nub of the policy, and obviously, and again, as I said about Port Salford, inevitably there's some overlap here. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the allocation, which has got the small total of 54 criteria, which we're going to have to go through. Only 54 criteria we're going to have to go through in turn. So. So I've got a cold sweat doing that. But we'll need to go into, so obviously I know there are very specific concerns, by all means raise them now, but we probably will get into the absolute nitty-gritty of it at a later date. What I really want to talk about, I suppose, is, again, the principle of this being a location for significant growth and anything in this policy which is ineffective, unsound, so on and so forth. So I think, it's probably been rehearsed quite a lot, but just to set the scene, you know, what is it about this location that justifies that significant increase in scale and nature? Seems to me we've got an area which is already partially identified in the development plan for growth, and there's already some committed development. However, the vision for New Carrington seeks to increase the size of development, including greenfield and greenbelt. So what's, if you like, justified that taking from what you've got to something very much significantly greater?
New Carrington, as you've mentioned, has been included in the local plan core strategy, and I believe its predecessor, is that right, Claire? UDP, for a number of years. It is unfortunately quite a complicated site. It has a number of different land uses in it, with a number of different considerations that need to be taken into account of that. It has proved quite a challenging site to assimilate and in terms of to then bring forward, but development is now started to happen on certain parts of the site, as you've alluded to. The requirement for us to expand and widen the area of the proposed allocation beyond what it currently is in the existing development plan is first and foremost because the land supply that we have within the borough doesn't allow us to meet our requirement in PFE with a sufficient flexibility allowance in order to allow for the market and site specifics on various sites to not come forward. It's also a recognition of the fact that this area is a fantastic opportunity for the area to be regenerated. The adjacent communities of Partington and Carrington, and indeed to an element of Sale West as well, really would benefit from an injection of regeneration and rejuvenation in a number of other social infrastructure and community benefits that would arise from development of the wider site. It also, large parts of the site are large parts might be argued one way or t'other, but there are large elements of the site which are previously developed, which do need to be dealt with in a sensitive way. So the scale of development is that we're looking to release from the Greenbelt on this particular aspect is to address a multitude of matters at the site and in general the area generally, but also to take account the fact that we have a housing requirement and a housing need, and the regenerative benefits of the site as a whole, which a greater scale of development would make more viable, more suitable, and ultimately more deliverable without having to look elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Outside of the Greenbelt issue, and obviously will be picked up, there's obviously other, both within, if you like, what seems to be the existing area, or existing committed area, considerable environmental constraints, in terms of, again, and not just other things like agricultural, but also the coma, the hazardous waste, all of those kinds. I'm not going to go way through, but you're familiar with them. I think everyone's familiar with them. How have they been taken into account in a very broad way? We're going to get into this, but in a very broad way to say, actually, we can justify. Yeah, it's a justified location with all these constraints. It's a justified location, but also it's a deliverable location with all of those issues in train. Just confident. How have you done it?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there are a number of matters at Carrington that have come forward over the years and which have been taken into account. So, in a sort of keeping things nice and simple as much as possible, obviously we've developed an indicative master plan for the site which demonstrates how the site could potentially come forward to deliver the quantums of development that we're seeking on both residential and employment purposes. We obviously have engaged with the Health and Safety Executive over the course of doing that. They don't normally comment on local plans, but we are in discussions with them about making sure that the quantum that we've got is in the right locations. We're happy that it does that. So from that point of view, it's the master plan within which that they have been involved, which has then informed the policy and the quantums within that. So we are confident, as much as we can be at this stage, that the amount of development that's proposed at Carrington can be delivered predominantly in accordance with, but not subject to, the details contained within the master plan that's provided as a supporting document, but the detail of which will come after the adoption of places for everyone, if indeed that happens, whereby we can then pull that forward in the right way with engagement with partners, stakeholders and members of the community, etc.
So if I may also just add to that, I think another thing that's quite important in terms of deliverability is that unusually there is it's a very big site, but we also have a very large landowner that doesn't cover the entirety of the allocation, but does cover a significant element. And I think when you're dealing with some of these complex issues, like remediation, like infrastructure, like all these other things that you would encounter because of the legacy of the area, the fact that you have a large principal landowner certainly makes that easier than perhaps if you had a fragmented pattern of ownership, which might is often the case, to be honest, on big sites. Thank you.
Thank you. I think obviously comparing this policy to JPA 33 is, this policy doesn't say anywhere near as much. So I will just say what it goes through some of the points that it does say. In terms of infrastructure that will be needed, so I think that's paragraph 3, major investment in active travel, etc. Two things there. One is that consistent with JPA? Are those measures in there consistent with JPA 33? And are those interventions listed in paragraph 3 all critical? Are these the critical things to delivering New Carrington?
I'm pretty sure that it's consistent across JP Strat 11 and JPA 33 in terms of the elements of infrastructure which are listed in paragraph 33. These elements are, some elements are, well, they're not all critical in terms of the development could take place to a certain point without them, but given the scale that we're looking at, so beyond plan period, we're looking circa 5,000 homes, 350,000 square metres of employment space. There will be a limit to which that can be accommodated within the existing infrastructure that is there. The specific timing and delivery and phasing of this infrastructure to unlock the development parcels which could then deliver that is a matter of discussion and something which needs to be fleshed out through the detailed master planning process and indeed through forthcoming planning applications and discussions with developers. But from where we sit and the modelling that we have had done at a high level for this strategic plan, the matters listed in paragraph 3 we consider to be of the most importance in terms of making sure that the site does come forward and is capable of being delivered to its maximum and making the best use of the site is there. We're cognizant of the fact that it's a very, very large site. It would be remiss of us to not take all the opportunities available to us to make sure that was accessible internally and externally via a range of transport modes, particularly active travel, bus, walking, cycling, bus infrastructure. And as we've talked about before, perhaps not before, but we are working. This isn't an indication that this is to solely come forward from private sector investment. This is a strategic policy which sets out the direction of travel for the area known as New Carrington, and that will encompass and does encompass, particularly with regards to certain elements of infrastructure currently going through the process, public sector investment, public sector funding. So this isn't solely setting out.
So you're not seeing this as your, sorry to interrupt you, but you're not seeing this as your like section 106 part of the policy that says this is what developers will be required. This is these are the things that broadly will need to be delivered, and then go to JPA 33 for the detail, and so on. Yeah. This
isn't an exhaustive list. It is an indication of the key elements of infrastructure we believe we have the evidence to suggest are required to unlock the site. But it's not an indication of that we expect all of it to be funded from the private sector from applications. There is other funding streams that we are actively tapping into and trying to push for to bring forward to unlock the site.
It may well be, and I think this is again case with Port Solva, maybe a chicken and egg thing with some of this. So once we've been through JPA 33, it may be where we have to again look at this policy with fresh eyes, I suspect, and those sort of things to see. But I mean, I suppose thinking about what this policy is for, and it's almost solely for setting the scene with JPA 33, you would expect, would you expect this policy to encompass the absolute requirements of everything? So as I see it at the moment, it talks about the integrated nature of the development of what you want to do. It's got some broad issues about enhanced green infrastructure and maximum regeneration benefits. So when it talks about transport, but it doesn't. There's not. Is that missing? In terms of high level aspirations and objectives, is that missing anything? Particularly if maybe thinking about some of the environmental aspects. I mean, are there any things which are in JP 33 which you would absolutely expect to be delivered and so should form part of the strategy? Again, it may be a circular thing. We may come back to this once we've seen JP 33.
I think that's the point, isn't it? Because when you look at the allocation policy itself, I mean, gosh, well, what's not in there? So
it's not a lot.
So, query. I mean, there's obviously at the end of Strat 11, we've got the reference to allocation policy 33. So let's be read together.
I suppose, again, maybe I'm overthinking it. Sometimes over the way my mind thinks is if this policy's got a purpose.
Yes.
And you've already suggested, well, if it wasn't there, it might not make a massive difference. But that's not necessarily an unsound issue. I get that. But if this policy's got a purpose, and that purpose is to say this is our vision for New Carrington, I suppose it's important. Leading question, is it important that it encompasses all of what you're expecting out of New Carrington, and whether or not those two effectively, the first paragraph is scale, second paragraph is about layout, if you like, or form, third layout about infrastructure. Is that it? I mean, the answer might be yes. Your answer might be yes now, but
So I don't think it can be exhaustive because, you know, what I suppose it endeavours to do is set those broad thematic areas. And I guess this is the point that perhaps when we've done the detailed allocation policy, we may feel that, you know, there ought to be something in here that's perhaps not mentioned. But I think that's the intention, is that it is, you know, it's that strategic overview. It does include those things that are, you know, the kind of broad things that are going to be necessary to and important to make this work. And I suppose we would hope that we have captured that list effectively and striking a balance between, you know, what we're trying to achieve here, which is that, you know, strategic look at the area versus the detail which is in the allocation policy. And as you say, you may find that perhaps having looked at that, it's appropriate that certain things are either shifted one way or the other.
I'm also mindful of the fact of, again, starting from the premise, if you like, that Trafford don't believe there's any local plan role, and then suggesting, well, actually, there might, you never know how things pan out, there might be a local plan role. Well, JPA 33 won't be relevant to the local plan. This policy might. So it's about making sure this policy is fit for purpose. But again, I think there's a bit of an iterative thing on that, and it may well be there's no issue there or anything. But I just want to, again, I guess, flag that up as something I'm thinking about. Okay.
It would be ironic if the net result of this is not to shorten policy 33, but to lengthen policy 11. That would be that would be.
If all 54 criteria were sound, you know.
That would be a very interesting outcome. But no, fair enough. So
we'll
await your guidance.
Obviously, some policies have got one criteria and some have got 54. Again, I think the evidence of different authors, but we'll put the pin in that till January. It may. I think just in terms of modifications, we asked the question about, obviously, that this policy refers to 4,300 dwellings and 350,000 square metres of employment floor space, which reflected JPA 33 in terms of up to the end of the plan period. We asked the question, well, does that work in terms of a strategic policy? And you've, I think, concluded that no, actually, I think we think it should reflect the overall requirement. Again, anything to add to that?
No, so we've now, with the mod, we've got both, haven't we? We've got within the plan period and beyond the plan period. So that seems fair enough, frankly.
Okay. At least it's consistent.
Yes, indeed.
See if anybody comments on that. And then I think figure 4.8, we move on to, so it's not actually a lot relatively in the policy, particularly when you, so the policy is those four paragraphs, and so I think I've covered what I can cover on those. I'm sure people will have to say something about that, but I think we'll move on to the figure 4.8. Very familiar points, I think. Red row, I think through Barton Moore, again, foreshadowed this. We're talking about it's not necessarily possible to differentiate between the interventions that are necessary, those that aren't necessary, and we know this is a common theme. So unless obviously somebody wants to make that point, I think we're all aware of that now, and the need to we'll be thinking about that collectively, I'm sure, and what's needed. But you'd like to just come back on that particular point.
Yeah, so listening to the comments already, and I agree with the council, is probably not merit in lengthening Strat Policy 11. We agree with the council that it's needed and it serves a purpose as a hook for the local plan. I think our only concern is that by stealth, Section 106 requirements don't end up in the plan. I would have thought that the key headings of major investment in active travel, public transport and highways infrastructure are the hooks that are required. And then by removing reference to the Carrington Relief Road or the Junction 8 of the M60, or also the specific items, and having them in the JPA 33, that stops any sort of the repetition or conflicts. Not that we don't think those things should be coming forward. So. I
think I understand, thank you. So remove the maintain the principle, remove the specificity. Easy for me to say on a Friday. Okay. Any other point? I will open it up now. I think any other points, but you wanted to make one more about this project, or is it just figure 4 point? I mean, anything else to say while you had
No,
the
it's
chair?
just the figure 4.8. I do have comments on the start of the policy set.
Yeah, so say we'll go through all the points now. So if you want to make that point, make it.
Which one? So about the part of the start of the policy.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll open it up now. I'm opening it up now.
Sure. I've heard Mr. Tucker's warnings about policy site-specific elements, and I'll try and stray away from it. But I need to touch on the nature of JPA 33 and how that 4,300 numbers come about to make my point, sir. That the New Carrington master plan, in essence, gets to the 4,300 number through presenting a housing trajectory in its New Carrington master plan, which phases greenfield land out towards the back end of the plan and beyond the plan. And that's a point we've already made objection to in terms of Strat 9 about prioritising brownfield land. The point that we would make, and we will go on to in Matter 23, why we think the phasing of some greenfield land outside of the plan period is harmful to the allocation and its delivery, but that's, I think, is a point for Matter 23. But if you take both of those points, sir, when we make them, then if you take them, this policy, we feel, would need amending to state that at least 4,300 dwellings. We welcome the council's modification at 5.165 that it proposes of its matter statement, in all senses other than needing the addition of at least 4,300 homes, so as not to prevent either now or in a future local plan the bringing forward of appropriate and sustainable development in the allocation earlier than the council envisaged. We don't see any harm in that happening, and we feel that the way the policy is written at the minute could be conceived as preventing that. The second point on that, if you take my point, is that I note that there's been separate conversation about whether or not the plan period would need to be taken further into the 2030s, depending on when the plan's adopted. If that happens and this policy changes, we would suggest that because the 4,300 number has been reached based on phasing, that number 4,300 would need to increase in line with the council's projected housing trajectory. And just so you've got the numbers in front of you, sir, the New Carrington master plan envisages a further 301 homes coming forward in 37-38, 214 homes in 38-39, and then 130 homes in 39-40. That's
okay. Would that take you up to the full 5,000 then?
I think it's
just
40,
under
46 units beyond.
Arithmetic in my head as we go through, not quite 700, but yeah. Okay, thank you. And I think there was some, again, recognition, I suspect, that discussions yesterday about numbers would need to be updated throughout the plan if that was a mod that was made.
Yes, I don't know off the top of my head what the numbers would be, but obviously if the plan period changes, then we need to catch up with that.
Thank you very much for that. Emery?
Thank you, sir. A few different points, some of them overarching. Wayne Estates are the principal landowner at New Carrington. I think has already been alluded to, there is an existing strategic allocation in the core strategy, and therefore we completely agree with the council that if there's a need to meet development needs, it's an entirely logical place to look. Clearly, sir, we've set out in some detail in our representations on our statement the strategic justification, and those matters go to the heart of the exceptional circumstances in relation to this site. Just to highlight some of the key points, this site really is all about delivering transformational regeneration, both in terms of the extensive area covered by the former Shell petrochemical facility and the remediation that's going on there, and the regenerational impacts on the neighbouring regeneration areas of Partington, Carrington and Sale West, and delivering that through jobs, enhancements to the built environment and the natural environment, and connecting these areas and enhancing accessibility. And in that regard, there are very significant highways benefits in terms of the Carrington Relief Road, which is a critical piece of infrastructure for the council that requires this allocation to fund it. And it will have, it's not just a relief road, it will have active travel at its heart and will serve to connect those regeneration areas. And it will also deliver, because there's a single landholder with extensive land holdings, there's a fair, not necessarily unique, but there's a very significant opportunity to deliver wider enhancements to the retained green belt across those wider land holdings. I think Mr. Fisher's already pointed you to the fact that there is a key principal landowner here, and clearly that's key in delivering the site, not just the main body, but the relief road itself. Virtually all of the land required for that is controlled by our client, and this site has been subject to extensive work and discussions and negotiations for many years with the council and with numerous bodies, such as obviously you alluded to the COMA and the HSE, and we have agreements in place with the HSE in relation to a master plan for those areas and what level of development can be delivered within them. I think clearly in terms of where are there some differences between us, I think we'll go into matter 23. Clearly my client is promoting some modifications in terms of the quantum of development and the boundaries. But we'll deal with that at another session. In terms of this particular policy, we've just raised one change. I think Mr. Gilbert referred to something similar earlier, but we have or our position is that the reference to the specific highway schemes which are listed in Strat 11 should be deleted, and that's because, and I think it's endorsed by what we heard earlier this week in terms of the changes that are now proposed to paragraph 11.10 of the plan that comes out of the SRN work, but also the locality assessments, which is their high-level assessments and effectively based on worst-case scenarios. Now, I think in terms of this policy, I think we say that actually the relief road that's absolutely unquestionably required to deliver this site, and we certainly wouldn't contest that, and we have no issue with the inclusion of that within any policy. But the other improvements, including junction 8 of the M60, that will be subject to further assessment, and I think as the documents that we saw earlier this week confirm. So we wouldn't want that set out in the policy. Clearly, in terms of the wording of the policy, to be fair, it does say such as, but it then obviously says will be required, and I think in terms of reading that, and then obviously junction improvements at junction 8 are then set out on the key diagram, figure 4.8. So I think picking the plan up, it would appear that those definitely are required, whereas that's something that they may well be needed, but it will be subject to further assessment. Thank you.
Sorry, just checking JPA 33 what he said. We'll come on to that. I think you're right. I will remember the relationship between those two paragraphs and what's in JPA 33, and we'll talk about, and then obviously, yes, the implications of what was discussed the other day. I want to keep two sides separate, but I think even though you were first, I think I'll come to Lichfields.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of additional minor points. I think they will come out of the discussion that we have about JPA 33, particularly the wording in the second paragraph of things like enhancing the quality of places and their local character, and whether that's a requirement or part of the policy, or that's just an effect of the development, and also the sort of justification for enhanced green infrastructure. They're all things that we're sort of required to explore the evidence for those things through the sort of terms of the policy itself. So I don't want them to get lost and for us not to come back to them as part of the later debate.
Okay. As I've said before, I'm sure you won't let that happen, but I will remember it anyway. But okay, thank you for that. I will come on, yeah, if you want to take your points, and then thank you.
Obviously, I've written a book on New Carrington, so...
Are you friends of Carrington Moss now?
I am friends of Carrington Moss at this point. So my first point on the policy, and I'm sure there will be overlap that we'll discuss on the at the JPA 33 session, is there's no mention in the policy of sustainability principles. It does mention it in paragraph 4.73, but I picked up from Mr. Kukowski earlier that the paragraphs are not, they don't have the same status as the policy itself, which is something I've learned today. It's been a very learning experience. So given that there's no mention of sustainable principles, I'm rather concerned, given this is the largest development in the whole of P4E. And I think that's reflected in the discussions that we're having about transport. That major investment in transport, I think I would question the use of the word major. The only commitment in this area is the Carrington Relief Road. I disagree with the comments from the other side that this is what's essential. What is essential is sustainable freight transport. There is no mention of that anywhere, either in the policy or the allocation. And as I mentioned earlier this week, a recent planning application has been agreed, and that's going to put 700 HGVs on local roads when it's fully operational. So with no sustainable freight options and plans to release Greenbelt to increase the number of warehouses in this area, I think it's it just lacks belief, really, given that we are supposed to be moving towards sustainable development. There is also no commitment to sustainable passenger transport options. There are mentions of passenger options, transport options in the transport strategy, but they are effectively passenger transport infrastructure, not increases in the services themselves. And there have been several mentions of the prior core strategy in the UDP by other people this morning. The UDP and the core strategy, UDP 2006 and the core strategy 2012, both mention improving public transport for the residents of Partington, Carrington and Sale West, none of which has been delivered. So I have to say the lack of commitment to this does not give us confidence that this will happen. Just one other point about the previous documents. The core strategy mentioned Carrington Moss as a carbon sink, unique in Trafford, and should be retained as mitigation against the climate emergency. And I have to say that given that that was agreed in 2012, I think it was very forward thinking of Trafford at that time. We seem to be going backwards now. I would also just question this idea that this is going to create transformation in the area. Job opportunities, there isn't any evidence in the plan about how the current jobs are distributed in local communities, but a local school has done some investigation with businesses in Carrington, and less than 5% of jobs are taken by people who live in the area. 82% of people drive to the place because there's such limited public transport. So I think really we need to have some evidence that this transformation is going to actually happen. It's my understanding that the largest business that's moved into the area brought all their staff with them from Stockport. So I think, you know, these are great words, but what in fact is going to happen is the elimination of the rural economy in the area. And I think we'll come on to this at JPA 33, but, you know, there are over 1,000 horses stabled on and around Carrington Moss, and that's not my figure, that is from the British Horse Society. And those businesses and their supply chains will be significantly impacted by this plan. I think the other point that I just want to mention is the one that you picked up yourself, sir, just to mention about the environmental improvements not being mentioned in the policy. And it is very focused on the on the economic aspects, demonstrating how important they are perceived to be. And there's nothing in the policy itself about the social or the environmental expectations or aspirations. So I just wanted to mention that. I just had a couple of points about the graphic as well. Warburton Bridge isn't shown on the graphic. It's a key local transport corridor which is the subject of a current public inquiry, the outcome of which might result in changes to transport movements in the area. I'd also like to see the irreplaceable habitat shown on the graphic as well, but I recognise the intention to keep it simple.
That loaded. I think GMC are going to want to do the latter, but we'll talk about that. The bit of a loaded word, isn't it? The irreplaceable bit. I think we might dispute that, but we will. Well, we won't dispute it. Anyway, I take the point. Yeah. We will definitely be talking about that.
They are an important
issue
asset.
Again. Yes. Yeah.
So, just one final point. The Greater Manchester Strategy highlights 6 growth locations, but New Carrington, despite being the only opportunity to deliver a new settlement of a significant size, which is not mentioned in the spatial strategy at all, isn't mentioned in the Greater. And there is that investment won't follow this this policy, because it's not listed as a key location. It's not a growth location in the Greater Manchester Strategy. So my concern is that it won't attract the investment that's needed, and we do know that the viability of this site is very finely balanced, to put it in a sensitive way.
Thank you. I think the last point in a way is sort of the first point really, because if it's, how, I guess, to the extent that which these things should all be consistent, if they need to be or not, and that's not area of debate, I suppose, but the point about reflecting the GM strategy as a whole, I mean, we have seen in other answers to questions that part of this plan is supposed to be reflecting the investment, et cetera, of the GM strategy. So it does go to the heart of the justification for this being location. That's a fair point. Lichfield, is your signed up? Sorry, yeah. So, so on that, there's quite a range of things, but if you're okay to go through.
Yes, thank you, sir. I'll try my best. The number of points were made about, either adding things to Strat 11 or taking things out of Strat 11. So, as far as we're concerned, what's in there is sufficient to perform the role that we've explained for this policy earlier on. Is it necessary in order to make the plan sound to either add things to it or to take things away from it? Our answer to that is no, but obviously you'll consider all the points that have been raised. There was a particular point about inserting words such as at least. As you know, in our modifications, we've got the word around. And again, the question arises, is it necessary in order to make the plan sound in order to say at least rather than around? We don't think so. Then in relation to transport improvements, well, I've already said that we don't consider that things should either be added to or removed from Strat 11, so that would include the various transport improvements which were referred to. But I do just want to say again that we have already touched on, and I think we're going to be coming back to this, how this plan explains the role of the various transport improvements that are referred to in the plan, and as to whether or not the notion is that if a transport improvement is mentioned in a policy, whether it's a Strat policy or it's an allocation policy, does that mean that the expectation is that developers will pay for that improvement? And you've already heard indications this morning in relation to the new Carrington that it's not envisaged that's the case across the board. But we need to explain that, and I've asked for us to collect together all of the modifications that we propose to try to clarify this point, and we're going to just stand back from them to see whether, frankly, it's getting a bit messy, and we need one to explain it once. My current view is that we should explain it once before we get to the Strat policies, and then once before we get to the allocation policies. So you'll find it twice in the plan, but you won't find it in, as we have at the moment, all sorts of little jumbled up places and so on, where we've had a thought and we thought we'd be able to spell it out here. So we're just going to stand back from that and work out how best to do it. But the intention we've already touched on at an earlier session is to try to make clear that these things are not necessarily expected to be paid for by developers. It would be a question of planning applications coming forward, testing things out, what can be legitimately sought under Regulation 122, etc., etc. So we're going to find a way of clarifying that, and as I say, our current thought process is that the clarification will come once before you start reading these Strat policies, and then again before you start reading the allocation policies, but we'll come back to you on that. So we don't intend to take out these references to highway improvements, rather we intend to clarify their role moving forward. Then we get to the points made by Friends of Carrington Moss. I mean, a number of the points made, I think we best pick up when we come to the allocation itself, frankly. But I do just want to ask about those overview, the more overarching points rather than the detailed points about carbon sinks and so on. And they are, I think I'd run the two together in a way, or ask those to my left to deal with them anyway. That's, first of all, is it right to imagine the intention, the aspiration, the plan is that there should be transformative regeneration at New Carrington, and is that a sort of forlorn hope, or is it a reasonable sort of expectation to have, given what we know of the area and what's in the plan? That's the first point. And the second point is this point about the Greater Manchester Strategy. I mean, is this in effect something which isn't foreshadowed in the Greater Manchester Strategy, yay or nay? And if not, then why is it here?
Yes. So on that first point of the regeneration, absolutely part of the rationale is to address regeneration in adjacent communities. And of course, you've got most notably Partington, which was a Manchester Overspill estate, right next door to a significant amount of the proposed development, but also equally parts of Sale West also have that kind of legacy of deprivation as well. So absolutely that is fundamental to the philosophy, and there's a point here about the kind of plan as a whole, because of course we have policy JPJ1 supporting long-term economic growth, which we will no doubt come to in due course, but that includes provisions for local labour agreements. And so whilst, we know that, you can build a factory and people will come from wherever they come from, but in terms of making that link, the plan does include tools that will, improve that situation and make that linkage. In terms of the Greater Manchester Strategy, then Carrington, quite simple, Carrington falls within the Western Gateway. So in all the discussions that we have, of which there are many, about the Greater Manchester Strategy and the delivery alongside that, which feeds way beyond planning into areas of economic development and social and community initiatives. Carrington is very much part of the Western Gateway and is plugged into all of those conversations at a Greater Manchester level.
Thank you very much. Any other points? I mean, I see this discussion as very much the opening to a much wider and longer discussion about this. So this is I'm not going to be coming to too many conclusions about this today, because we've got a bigger issue on this later on. So, but I will obviously take any other comments anyone's got now before we draw to a close. Any other points? No. Thank you very much. Anything you want to add? So that's that, and thank you very much. As I say, we're not going to go through any action points today. We'll save those for a later date. So once again, thank you all for your contributions this morning, and for those who've been here earlier in the week. We will adjourn now until 9:30 on Tuesday morning. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.